Profiles and Issues is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. It is a show that profiles people and issues that affect the church in the modern world. Your program host is Father James Korda.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Profiles and Issues. I'm Father Jim Korda. Our issue is world religions. To help me profile this issue is Sister Nancy Dawson. Welcome to our show.
Oh, I'm delighted to be back again.
Why are people so fascinated with religion in general? Why?
I think probably because they're looking for meaning. Like, I teach about 120 students a semester at YSU, and they are interested in the meaning questions. And I think that a great many of the world religions address some of the same questions and meaning questions and have many similarities, needless to say, a lot of differences, but a lot of similarities too. I could point out, for example, between Islam and Christianity and Judaism, basically they all three feel that Abraham is their father. That would be an example. They all believe in a heaven or hell. They have that in common. Many of them will have dietary regulations that they follow, maybe in different seasons. Some of them will be, all three, of course, are monotheistic. So when you look at the similarities in them, I think that we find there are great similarities, particularly in those three religious traditions.
We talk a little bit about, a lot more nowadays, about being spiritual. And a lot of young people say, well, I'm more spiritual than I am religious. What's the difference between those two phenomena?
Well, I think they associate sometimes the word religion, or they make a differentiation between spirituality and religion. Like I think the word in Latin, religion means to join again or to connect again, if you think about a ligament that brings things together. And I think that when they talk about spirituality or they're practicing it, they're talking about that inner journey where they want to relate to another, whether you call that other Allah or Adonai or Jesus. And there is that longing and that desire to have meaning in their life.
And hopefully religion does that for people. It brings them to the spiritual because ultimately it's faith that sustains us.
Exactly. To give you a couple of concrete examples of that, for example, in Buddhism, the meaning question was, why do we have suffering in this world? And these students can identify with that. They've had parents that died or grandparents or losses in their friendships. And so I think the meaning question there is, why is there suffering? You remember that book that came out, Why Do Good People Suffer? Well, it's a meaning question, and they look for the answers when they study Buddhism, which we do. And of course, moderation becomes part of the answer, but also meditation, reflection, yoga. And I always tell them, if you spend 10 minutes a day or 20 minutes a day in reflection, it's going to change your life. It's going to change your life. One student went to the doctor recently, and he said to her, he was a Catholic doctor, and he says to her, you know, you should take 10 minutes a day just to reflect. And she said, oh, I already learned that at YSU. I had a laugh. But that's an example of how they're looking for it. Or if you took one question that they're always looking at is, how can you be free? You know, that's a young person, well, old person too, question. How can we have freedom? And again, when we look at the Hindu religion, that is the question. How do you achieve inner freedom? And what is the way to do that? And they would say, well, get rid of your desires. So if you don't want a car, you don't want another house or a third garage or fourth, get rid of the desire. Then you're going to be happy and you're going to be free and you'll be free of suffering. And so they call that moksha in that particular tradition. So I think students and young people and everybody, I think universally, is trying to see how do you connect with something meaningful and how do you name that something that you're connecting with. In our case, of course, we name it Jesus. But other traditions have other names.
That's interesting because you had mentioned earlier that there's similarities in religions, and I think in the major world religions there are similarities. And how important is it for us to build on those similarities so we could have that ultimate peace, not only in our lives but ultimately in the world?
I think knowledge, I think education helps to do that. If I may use a couple examples of religions from China, we studied Taoism, and it says, go with the flow. You know, you get that whole idea of Star Wars, you know, go with the Force. And the students kind of like that, by the way. You know, going with the flow is wu wei. It's effortless. Education won't matter. You go with what you feel good about in yourself, that you're talented in or gifted in. You go that way. Whereas in the counterpart of that, but really it's kind of like the yin and the yang, the Confucian would say, no, education's the most important thing, that we educate ourselves, and they're not different, that you need good leadership. And if you're going to have an educated person and you have good leadership, you're going to have a good society. But those two complement each other. One is the environmental issue, and the other is the leadership issue. So I think you take what's good in those religions and see as it is the yin and the yang.
And how important is that whole sense of respect for other religions? You know, sometimes we have this myth about certain religions. Why is it important to not only understand, but to be respectful of someone's religious faith?
I think that's part of education too, that we're not trying to tolerate other religions, but what we're trying to do is to respect them, like you said, that the basic qualities of most religions is that idea of respect for the person. And almost all of the world religions, to some degree, I can't say all of them, are concerned about the woman's issue, concerned about environment, and that we can learn aspects of those issues, equality, human dignity, trafficking, and the gross errors and abuse that happens in that particular issue. But I think most of the world religions are coming to grips with that, and also developing a cosmic view of the world. Some religions want to, if you think about eschatology or the end of the world, some would say, well, maybe everybody has a little piece of the whole, and when it all comes together, it'll be like Chardin's theory, we'll all be one, whether you want to name it Jesus Christ or whether you want to name it from another faith tradition. So I think that those basic values belong to most religions of the world today.
And how do you see that's changing in our world? You know, I'm trying to think maybe 50 years ago, at least in the Catholic faith, we were not to go into a Protestant church, so there was that whole sense of being to ourselves. And how has that changed over the years for the good?
Oh, I think it's changed. For example, in the Protestant tradition, there is a freedom to interpret the scripture, to interpret the way of life. An individual is allowed to do that. And I think that in many religions, we see that whole interpretive issue coming to play, particularly in the Hebrew tradition. It used to be that the rabbi did all of the interpreting in the Midrash and the interpretation. In the Catholic Church, I think it was in the 60s when the new document came out that now you can look at Scripture, we can look at others' interpretations of it. So I think that we've come a long way, and particularly in the whole movement of ecumenism today, where we welcome one another into our sacred spaces. For example, the Islamic temple here in town, always in the spring, has an open house. Many churches will do that, and they will show you their ritual. They will tell you about their holy days. And again, in Christianity and Islam and Judaism, they all have their holy day. You have Friday, then you have Saturday, and then you have Saturday and Sunday in our tradition. So I think it's kind of significant that we are changing, that we're developing, but that basically those values are universal values. Respect for the dignity of person, to observe the differences, to not tolerate but to appreciate them. I think that's key.
Let's take a different approach now. We know that in the Middle East there's lots of issues, there's lots of chaos that's been there for centuries. Why is it that the three major religions that occupy those areas somehow can't find a centeredness or commonality that helps bring them out of this chaos?
I wish we could answer that question. However, as you know, and I think a lot of folks do not understand that, for example, in the Islamic tradition, that you have the Sunnis and the Shias. And that's a hereditary issue, basically. All the time, we often hear people say it's jihad, the one group is jihad. And it's all about hereditary, that Ali was the son-in-law, of course, and in this faith tradition of Muhammad, and Abu Bakr was his friend. Only 15% of the population are Shias, and yet our media shows that, and I love the media, and I think it does wonderful things for us, but a lot of times you only see that one, it's like I think 7 or 8% really that are the terrorists. And in our media, that's what is advertised, and that's where we see. And of course, they believe there's a whole succession of imams. Some say 5, some say 7, some say 12. But that is one tradition, and then the other, of course, is instead of the imam as a spiritual leader, you have the caliph, who is a political and social leader. And I think sometimes when the politics and the religion start becoming one, as we saw at the time of Constantine in the early development of the church, with the edict of tolerance. So I think sometimes, again, the hope is that we will come together like that, and that we can work together. And again, I think it's going to take time. It's developmental, and it's going to take patience and appreciation and education.
We're coming down to the last couple minutes of our first segment together. Let's talk about the role of prophets. They're very important in the life of many religions. What's the role of a prophet, and how can we better understand that in the 21st century?
Well, we know they're all very deeply spiritual people. I think that our new Pope Francis is going to be one of those charismatic leaders and prophets. But they all end up getting killed. And any prophet that was asked to be a prophet says no in the beginning, if you recall. Moses said, "I can't talk." And I think that's interesting, because one of my students wrote a paper on that. It was because he stuttered, and he felt he could not speak in God's name. But then there's a period of reflection, like Jonah, and then after the reflection period, they end up saying, "Okay, I'll do it." But we've had a lot of contemporary prophets, and continue today. Dorothy Day would be a good example of that, who's up for canonization with a lot of support.
And what does that say about us ordinary people? Are we called to be prophets?
Yes, I think that we give to others the face of Jesus Christ as Christians, or Allah if you're in another tradition, or Adonai if you're Jewish. But I always tell the students, you may be the only face they're going to meet. You're going to be the prophet. You're the one that's going to... And the gospel means good news, and so often we interpret it as bad news. So where's the good news, if you're looking into the negative side of things sometimes, especially if we take it literally,
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to take a quick break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Profiles and Issues. Our issue is world religions. And of course, Sister Nancy Dawson is here. What about atheism? A lot of people say, I just don't believe about anything. And then there's that term agnostic. Can you explain the two?
I wish I could explain all of it, but I cannot. When we talk about atheism, I think there's probably two different understandings of it. One is that I do not believe in God. I do not accept a God. But another stance on that would be, I don't accept any gods. which means all of the other faith traditions. There is none here. I think they make that differentiation. However, one of the questions that comes up that I find very interesting, and often we'll have students write about, is that they say that that religion itself, the word, that when you have a religion, there are certain components that go into that. So you have a belief system, you have rituals, you have their famous myths or their stories, you have their art that comes from it. And there's like 8 or 9 characteristics that Dr. Malloy, who writes on this, would say should exist to make something a religion. And the question comes up then, can you say that atheism is a religion then? If it does have certain writings, if they come together in community, if they have a common belief. I don't know, it's a question that I have not gotten an answer for, but I think it's a question that is speculated today. Now, a lot of times people will go through a period in their life when they're searching, and they'll be an agnostic, and they'll say, well, how can you know? You know, if I can know. And then, of course, you get the whole scientific thing, the whole evolutionary process today, where we're talking about the Big Bang Theory, how the world was created. How literally do you take the story of Genesis? It's exciting, really, to study some of these issues and to broaden one's perspective. And it does help you to be a little more appreciative of the other's position on these particular issues. There's some would say animism would be a characteristic of religion. Some say, well, there's life in everything. They may not have a soul, but they do have life. And or they have spirit, and so we have to reverence creation in reverence. Different from pantheism, where they would say, well, the tree is God, and the ground is God, and everything is God. I think a lot of people, not a lot, but a significant group today, are called non-theists. They would say, I don't have a position at all. I don't have a position. So I think there's a lot of speculation in terms of that term, atheism.
Do you think someone could be too religious? I've often wondered that myself. Not in the terms of a fanatic, but just too religious, just too, like that's my whole life and whole world. It should be, but
and they limit
them,
and they limit themselves
yes.
to that. Sometimes you see that. Maybe we would call it sometimes false piety. Where my life doesn't match up with my belief system, so that I can say I believe in human dignity, I believe everyone is the temple of the Holy Spirit, but the actions don't seem to fit in, or when one takes the literal interpretation of the Bible, which we see today. And again, it's a beautiful religion, the born again, and I get a lot of students in my classes who are born again, but when we talk, their description of the Scripture is very non-interpretive, and they actually take the word seriously to the nth degree, and yet actions don't always fit in with that piety or that belief system. And I think we see that in a lot of religions. Some are selective about what they want to believe. They pick out the things that they want to live out. Well, we've seen that in the seamless garment, from birth, when we're all against abortion, of course, but to see that seamless garment and yet have a person who could be a very religious and pious person saying, I believe in capital punishment. And it does happen, it does happen. So I think it's that inconsistency in one's piety or religious practice each day, and then the position that they will take in so many issues.
Let's talk historically. How old is religion? The world religions. Is there a date that we could? We know that many of the faiths that are practiced around the world have deep and long roots and heritage. Is there any time or date on that?
Well, if you were studying Judaism, they'd say we're 2,000 years old, But one of the very earliest that goes way, 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 way back is the Native American religions. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing when you study that faith tradition. We're going way back before the Common Era. And they're probably one of the oldest religions, and yet we have learned so much from them. The whole idea of tattoos, using the berries and getting tattoos. I often have students tell me about their tattoos. They're very revelatory about the person and about what they believe. But also they had their own rituals. The sweat lodge with the whole purification rite. And look at how far back, we're going way back, and say timelessness, and yet you have some of the same issues. The environmental issue, they never killed more buffalo than they could eat. They had a great respect for the animals. We find that thousands and thousands of years old, and because they did not have any written documents, they're often called oral religions or indigenous religions, some of which have been in the written about by Margaret Mead, in South Sea Islands, and some of their myths are absolutely beautiful. But you can trace some of the same issues in a new religion all the ways back for thousands of years.
And isn't there the truth that there's some common weaving and commonalities in all world religions? And I've often wondered myself, being ignorant about many of them, is that the element of God? Is that the element of the supreme being that permeates all of this?
One of the questions that comes up is if the resurrected Christ, and we know that we have a lot of theological views on that, but if the resurrected Christ transcended any nationality and any color and any definition, and that's why it was not recognized, if that is so, then maybe all these different names for God will emerge into one that will be a universal name. For us, it may be Jesus,
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about the Oriental religions. And when we say Orient, are we talking about Asia, or are we talking about a different part of religion?
Well, actually, India, I think, is a great example of a melting pot of religions. And many of the religions, such as Buddhism, Taoism, the Chinese religions, Confucianism, come from that particular country. They move from India, they move into China, then you see it in the islands of Japan. You will see Buddhism there, but a variety of schools. So when we talk about the Far East, we're talking about a certain set. But if we're talking about the Chinese religions, we're talking about Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism. And in the Tao, some of the beautiful writings that come out of that faith tradition are the Tao Te Ching, which is a beautiful book about nature that young people can enjoy, and it was written by a writer by the name of Lazo, who wanted to get out of China, by the way. And when he went, he was a librarian. They wouldn't let him out until he wrote the Tao Te Ching, the book. And so he had to come back and write the book. And then the myth is he gets on an ox when he's all finished, and he rides out to the end of China and goes off, never to be seen again. But see those stories there, aren't they beautiful? Mm-hmm. But in China, they have some wonderful. So when we're talking about Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism, we are talking about China. And then later on the islands like Taiwan, the Japanese islands, and how they were formed and the religion there. But there's many schools in all of these religions, and the schools will be in a different place. Some will be in the south of India, some might be in the north. So the schools themselves differentiate themselves, not so much in basic beliefs, but in practices.
We're coming down to the last few minutes of our time together. The one word that you used is stories, and how important are stories in all world religions, and how many stories are interconnected or similar?
And sometimes evolve from some of the older stories. But I think they're essential to any individual and to any faith tradition. For example, when they celebrate the Seder meal, the woman in the family, the mother, always reads the Exodus story. In the Christian tradition, the Paschal mystery, Christ came, died, rose from the dead, ascended into heaven, and sent the Spirit. Those stories have an incredible impact on our lives, but almost every tradition, if it is authentically a religion, will have that characteristic, that it has the stories. And each time those stories are repeated, we get a deeper glimpse into what they mean. I think we probably don't have time, but there was a preacher, someone was telling me about a lawyer who won 225 cases on murder, and he was asked if Jesus really rose from the dead. And you know what he said? Yes, because of 3 E's: the empty tomb, the eyewitnesses, and everybody believes that in our tradition. So I thought that was great. One of the priests told that story. I don't know where he got it, but it was true about the lawyer. It was true about the lawyer.
What does it say about our own stories as people of faith?
Because we are the church, and each one of our stories and the way we live out, let's say the Paschal Mystery, the way we live out the Trinity in our own communication and dialogue in union with one another, that is telling our stories, and each one of us in that tradition or the church, whatever religion it might be, with our stories is what makes the communal story. And then we name that story in the light of the mysteries of our faith. And I think that's what wonderful theologians have helped us to do. Tiller Chardin.
Let's tell the folks that are with us in closing what we need to do as people of faith, whatever that faith is, to be respectful of one another. What else is important in that whole aspect?
Listening to the stories. That once you establish a dialogical relationship with anyone in the world, once you do that and you hear the story, you can no longer turn those stories off. You cannot do that anymore because you become a part of their story. So I think that spending time reflecting, spending time of getting out of our comfort level and talking to people of other faith traditions, visiting other churches, asking them, my students, do interviews for one of their grades. They have to interview somebody of another faith they've never met, they don't know, and they use 8 characteristics that they asked them about. What do you do in a community when you come together? What do you believe? What's your art? What's your ritual? And you can't imagine how much you can learn from an experience like that. So I think it's sharing stories, moving out of the comfort level, moving out of the neighborhood, moving out of our in-house groups, that we can expand our horizon and really come to appreciate, not tolerate, every religion in the world.
Well, Sister Nancy Dawson, we certainly learned a lot today, and we certainly appreciate your not only expertise, but sharing your story with us. It meant a lot today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here, to be able to share it.
Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Profiles and Issues was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father James Korda.